Hi students, welcome to chapter 1 of your textbook. And the source for this chapter 1 is taken from the textbook Reflect and Relate, an introduction to interpersonal communication, 6th edition. All right, let's talk about the introduction to interpersonal communication. So when we're thinking about interpersonal communication, let's start by talking about what communication is. So communication is the process through which people create messages using a variety of modalities and sensory channels to convey meanings within and across contexts. So, to sum it up, you're basically trying to send messages and receive messages and provide feedback to one another. So these definitions that is provided there highlights the 5 features that characterize communication. The first one is that communication is a process and that those engaged in communication create messages to convey meanings. And to convey meaning, communicators choose from many different modalities. It can be face-to-face, it can be using your device like your cell phone, and it can be using voice, it can be using American Sign Language, for instance. And when you are communicating, people use various sensory channels, not only verbal, but also sound, sight, touch, scent, and taste. And number 5 is that communicators convey meanings within and across different contexts. So for instance, right now the context is this is a mini lecture within an academic context, but if you take it outside of the classroom, then you may have a different context, which is friendship context or family context, a discussion to talk about issues within your family, and so on. So the textbook also talk about what are the reasons for us to communicate. Number 1 is because we have a physical needs to communicate. So a broader study of over 3,500 adults revealed that as little as 10 minutes of talking a day, face-to-face or by phone, improves memory and boosts intellectual function. And that people with strong relationships have significantly lower risk of coronary disease, hypertension, and obesity than do people with less social integration. Isn't it fascinating? It's also because we have a practical needs. It's the tool that let us communicate our needs and desire from talking to our doctors to talking to our hairdressers. Now that we've talked about physical needs and practical needs, we also need to talk about identity needs. That communication is the primary way for us to learn who we are. Each of us enters the world with little or no sense of identity. We gain an idea of who we are from the way others define us, or from the way we define ourselves. And so when we're talking about identity needs, it is linked to the social needs, that communication is the principal way relationships are created. Despite knowing that communication is crucial to social satisfaction, evidence suggests that many people aren't successful at managing their interpersonal relationships. So I do want you to listen to this podcast. And this is an NPR interview with Dr. Robert Waldinger. And he is the head of research in Harvard University. And I want you, while you're listening to the podcast, I want you to think about what Dr. Waldinger is saying. Do you agree or disagree with him? And what are your reasons? I'm going to ask these questions in the discussion board. So, after you listen to the podcast, let's continue with the mini lecture. Whenever we're communicating with someone, there's always that opportunity for misconceptions. And when we're talking about communication misconceptions, we know that not all communication seeks understanding. Consider, for example, social rituals that we do every day. We ask, how's it going? You ask, and then the other person may reply, great, even if they're not actually feeling great. It's just what I would call as social lubricant for you to interact with one another. And that more communication is not always better. Sometimes people think that they need to over explain things, and there are times when we understand that more communication is not always better. And we also need to understand that communication will not solve all problems. It will solve most, but maybe not all. And that effective communication is not a natural ability. You're not born to become a great communicator. We learn through trials and error to become a better communicator. And to be able to understand this concept of communication, your textbook talks about 3 different communication models. The first one is the most simple version of it, is what we call it as linear communication model. And this model perceives communication as an activity in which information flows in one direction, from a starting point to an end point. It involves a sender who is sending a message to a receiver using specific channel, and that channel can be the air. That's how our voice carries to your ear, with a possible interruption from noise. So a noise is anything, both internally or externally, that may disrupt the communication process. So when we're thinking about internal noise, for instance, we're thinking about when we're hungry or when we don't get a lot of sleep, we may not be able to focus on what the other person is saying, and that's what we call it as internal noise. When we're thinking about external noise, we're thinking about like suddenly loud noises or people talking that disrupt our communication with another person, and those kind of noise are coming externally, not from ourselves. The next communication model is what we call it as interactive communication model, which also views communication as a process involving senders and receivers. However, it introduces 2 new elements, right? So this is a development from the simplest model. And these 2 new elements include feedback, which is a response from each participant, as well as fields of experience, which includes beliefs, attitudes, values, and experiences that each participant bring to a communication event. The third and more complex model is called as transactional communication model, and it suggests that communication is fundamentally multi-directional. So it's not just one point to another point, or one point to another point, and then from that point back to this point. Instead, it's like multi-directional. That is, each participant equally influences the communication behavior of the other participants. And from this perspective, there are no senders or receivers. Instead, all the parties constantly exchange verbal and nonverbal messages and feedback, and collaboratively they create meanings. Yeah, so these are a way more complex way of looking at it, instead of just a simple one send a message, the other one receive it, and the other one provide feedback to the other one. Yeah, this is more like continuously flowing, and everybody is involved in creating meanings. So now that we talk about communication, we talk about communication models, we talk about misunderstanding or misconception in communication, let's talk more about what is interpersonal communication. So in this course, we will learn about the concept of self and others, the importance of perception and understanding emotions, as well as how gender and culture influences our perceptions of the world around us. We will also learn how to be better listener and how to manage conflicts skillfully. We will get to know more about the verbal and nonverbal aspects of communications, And we will try to better understand relationship with our friends, family, romantic partners, and even co-workers. In other words, we will gain knowledge that is essential for maintaining healthy interpersonal relationships. So let's define interpersonal communication. It is a dynamic form of communication between two or more people in which the message exchange significantly influence their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. So now this definition has four important implications. First, interpersonal communication differs from some other forms of communication because it's dynamic rather than static. Yeah, it's constantly changing. And so interpersonal communication at the heart, at the core, is a dynamic type of communication. And it is much interpersonal communication is transactional with both parties contributing to the meaning. And that interpersonal communication is primarily dyadic. Dyad means two. It involves pairs of people or dyads. Remember, two? The often dyadic nature of interpersonal communication creates a distinctive break from intrapersonal communication, where you communicate with yourself in the form of talking out loud to yourself or having a mental conversation in your head. And interpersonal communication creates impact. It changes participants' thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships. It is completely different from impersonal communication. So in other words, when we're thinking about interpersonal communication, these are communication that are meaningful to you with the people who are important to you. That's why we're going to talk about friendships, family relationships, right? Romantic partnerships, as well as colleague or co-workers. Now, whenever we're talking about interpersonal communications, it's hard not to talk about the principles of communication competence, because the goal of being a good communicator is that you want to be a competent communicator. So what does it take to communicate better? Most scholars agree that communication competence is the ability to achieve goals in an effective, appropriate, and ethical manner. So appropriate communication is the degree to which your communication matches situational, relational, and cultural expectation regarding how people should communicate. We judge how appropriate our communication through self-monitoring, the process of observing our own communication and the norms of the situation in order to make appropriate communication choices. So appropriateness is key here. We're also talking about effective communication, right? The ability to use communication to accomplish three types of interpersonal goals: self-presentation, instrumental, and relationship goals. Don't worry about this. We're going to talk more about this, in the future chapters. As well as we want to strive to be an ethical communicator. And whenever we're thinking about ethical communicator, we need to talk about ethics, which are the set of moral principles that guide our behavior towards others. And so you need to pay attention to this characteristic of competent communication, which includes empathy or perspective taking, cognitive complexity, or the ability to construct a variety of different frameworks for viewing an issue, right? And then self-monitoring, the process of paying close attention to our own behavior and using this observation to shape it, as well as, making sure that you understand how this self-monitoring will help you become a better communicator. Now, I want to end this mini lecture by asking you these lecture check questions. Do you consider yourself as a competent communicator? Yes, no, maybe. Please explain your answer. And I'm also looking forward to hearing your take on the podcast that I asked you to listen. Please respond to this in your discussion board, and I look forward to reading your posts. Thank you.